Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Toronto, and welcome to Ryerson University. I'm Philip Mai. I'm the Director of Business and Communication here at the Ryerson Social Media Lab. Our lab studies how social media is changing the way people communicate and connect to each other. We also develop social media analytic tools and methods for other researchers. We're pleased to be the host of the 4th Altmetrics Conference. As the host, I would like to acknowledge that Ryerson University and Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississauga, and the Haudenosaunee that bounds them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent indigenous nations and peoples, European and all newcomers, have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I hope that you'll find the conference and your stay in Toronto both valuable and enjoyable. Next, I'd like to invite Mike Taylor, Head of Metrics and Development at Digital Science, to say a few words about the conference and to introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. On behalf of the organizing committee of the Altmetrics Conference, I very much welcome you to Toronto. When we first started talking about this conference about 4 years ago, the organizing committee were very much wondering, worrying almost, whether there was an audience for this kind of conference. There was, and we've gone on to do a conference every year since then. In 2 a.m., there was a tone amongst the conversation about whether there was now a need for a new word. The word was altmetrician that people were talking about. Was there now enough data, was there enough tools for there to be a new body of people who were professionals in the field of altmetrics? And a year ago, like an echo in Bucharest, we heard people from around the world starting to talk about the different use cases that they were seeing using altmetric data. There were people talking about novel use cases that had never been suggested by the people who had originally started this field. There were people from Africa, from East Europe, from South Asia, Southeast Asia, all of whom were talking about how they were choosing to use this kind of data that we call altmetrics. So here in Toronto, in our 4th Altmetrics Conference, I'm really looking forward to finding out what people are doing now and how altmetrics are going to be used in the future. The final session tomorrow evening is one in which you are all the panelists. I'm going to be the chair of that session, and I'm going to be listening to what you have to say over the course of these 2 days and to what suggestions you make. We have a special hashtag, Ask4AM, and there's a blog post with a link through to an app where you can post more notes. So for that half an hour, you're the panelists, I'm reflecting on what you're saying. So if you don't say anything, you're going to hear me talking for half an hour. I would very much like to introduce Anatoly Grut. Anatoly is the Canada Research Chair of Social Media here at the Ted Rogers School of Management, and he's the Director of Research at the Social Media Lab. Anatoly is the co-editor of Multidisciplinary Journal on Big Data and Society and the founder of the International Conference on Social Media and Society. Anatoly's research initiatives are strongly related to the work that we do in altmetrics. He's looking at how the advent of user-generated content and big data is changing the way in which we communicate and the structures in which we choose to communicate. He has an expertise in visualization and social media data. And the broad ambition of his research initiatives is to provide decision-makers with additional knowledge and insights into the behavior and relationships of online network members. These are things which are extremely familiar to those of us who work in the field of altmetrics. And in a couple of weeks' time, I should be hosting another event in Baltimore where, again, we're reflecting on how metrics are being used in the course of research evaluation and policy transformation. So, without any more further ado, can I ask you to join me in welcoming Anatoly to give the keynote presentation?
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, and welcome to Toronto and to Ryerson University. Let me just quickly switch to my slide deck. All right, so it's a great pleasure to be here and be part of the movement we called Altmetrics. And in case you want to follow my slides on your devices, I know screens may be a bit small this morning, just go to the link. I put my slides up on SlideShare. It's bit.ly, bit.ly/4am key. So I'll give you a second to write this down. When preparing for this presentation, I was reflecting and thinking about our first study that we did in 2010 and 11 that outlines how scholars use or adapting to use social media technology for their scholarly practices. And so one of the questions that we asked our study participants was, should social media be considered as part of one's tenure or promotion package? And the results were mixed. Most of the people said no, some said yes, but it should be case-by-case basis, and many said, well, if it's yes, we just don't know how. And these are, I want to mention, early adopters of the social media at the time. So what was most memorable for me at the time when I presented this work, some audience member questioned the research completely and said, well, should we now give tenure for tweeting? But 6 years later, and we're here, and the practices and attitudes are changing drastically. For example, let's look at this tweet, a recent tweet by an academic who says, thanks all who shared our paper. In 10 days, it's gained the highest altmetric score for its journal, and it's in the top 5% overall. What it tells us that social media used by scholars is becoming an effective tool to disseminate their work, as what's happening here, but it's also being used to assess and evaluate the reach of one's publication within days when it's published. Here's another example. This is a kind of Twitter conversation where one academic says, endlessly entertained by these periodics and retweeting of our paper by spam accounts, and this is what hashtag ScienceCom looks like. And then the response says, all adds to the altmetric score. It's a somewhat humorous message, but what it does confirm is just the generally acceptance and normalization of the practice of using social media, in this case tweeting, but also the notion of altmetrics in academia. So that led me to think about it, how did we get here? And so, of course, where are we going? And that's what I will try to answer in this presentation as a way to start the conversation at the conference. And to answer this question, where we came from and where we're going, we really need to go back and look at communication, scholarly communication practices before social media, before mailing lists, before emails. So the time when scholars like ourselves still use written communication, such as letters. And this is exactly what we're doing in one of the projects with my colleagues in Halifax, where we're comparing two data sets. One came from 100 years ago and is around a very prolific scholar, Gilpin. He was a mining engineer and prolific author in this area of earth sciences. And so we have a data set that was digitized of about 1,300 letters that he wrote or were written to him, an exchange between his collaborators and colleagues. And we're comparing the communication practices 100 years ago with more contemporary practices of scientists on Twitter. And so we have a set of scientists comparable with Gilpin's in terms of age, the area, earth sciences, as well as the output. And we're using network analysis and to represent these scholarly practices to compare the two. So on the left side, your left, you can see a communication network of who wrote to whom in the Gilpin data set. And of course, he would be the center of this network because most of the letters is from him or to him directly. And on the right side, you have a Twitter communication of one of the contemporary scholars. We can spend the whole hour just analyzing the data sets, but I just want to point out one big difference. So even though the size of the network is about the same, the Letters network has about 600 people, the Twitter network has about 750 people, and the number of connections comparable, 1,200 on the left and 1,500 on the right. What is different that the communication network based on written letters took about 9 months to generate, so to develop this communication network, versus the Twitter network took only a month or less. And this is just one affordance that social media allows us, essentially the efficiency with which we can spread and talk about research. But nowadays we can also use multiple platforms, so not just Twitter. One of our other projects where we examine again scholarly practices 3 years ago, academics said they frequently use multiple platforms, including non-academic social networking websites, blogs, wikis, and other platforms to communicate their research. And of course, this was 3 years ago, and the field changes very fast. The platforms may be changed, but the reason they use social media remain the same. And so what we found among top reasons why scholars using social media would include keeping up to date with topics in the field, following other researchers' work, discovering new ideas and publications, and of course promoting current work and making new connections. So those are some of the top reasons and benefits that scholars reported in our study. What we then did, we clustered, we grouped those benefits in related categories. Essentially, if you're using social media for this, you're also using it for something else. And we discovered 3 groups of academics who use social media. The first group was information gatherers. So essentially, academics who mostly use social media to consume information. Then you have a group of collaborators on the left side of this chart. And finally, the third group, they are networkers. They're socializing on social media. They're also disseminating research on social media. And this is a very important group for us in this field of altmetrics, because most of the data that we analyze is coming from this very active group of academics. But I also want to mention that it's, of course, not just academics who talk about research. More and more other institutions and organizations talk about research, including journalists, librarians, policymakers, and sometimes even unexpected groups. And I just want to mention one example from our experience when we tried to see who was talking about one of the papers we published on trying to understand why people connected on Twitter, which wasn't directly related to altmetrics. But we used kind of the altmetrics notion to see who is talking about this paper. And so to our surprise, we discovered a wine distributor in California was using results of our paper to blog about it and to talk to his community of other wine distributors, to teaching them how they should engage not just online but also offline. So it was quite amazing to essentially highlight that sometimes we don't even expect who is talking about our research online, but we only need to look. So what is also interesting, so as more people using social media to talk about research, they also contributing more data towards the social media data sets. And so all these social signals are becoming very valuable for various stakeholders. So academics can use it to discover what peers discussing, institutions and funders can use it to assess research impact, publishers can try to increase their readerships, feature most discussed papers, discover topics that can guide them through the process of call for papers for new issues, new books, and even appointment, tenure, and promotion committees can now look at the social media activities as a way at least to evaluate service component of our work. Another group of stakeholders, very important here, libraries and museums. And here I just want to share our experience working with libraries in the US, and specifically Biodiversity Heritage Library, and how for them, social media was important to make their digitized collection of historic books about plants and animal kingdom, to make that collection more social, more shareable. So in addition to helping them to incorporate some widgets for items to be shared, to discuss on social media, we also partnered with Altmetric to help us to track who is talking about their collection. And we found some interesting results. So teachers were actively using in high school, secondary school, materials to teach kids about plants and animals, but also video producers on YouTube use imagery from this digitized collection in their videos, in part because they were in public domain. But again, with something we didn't expect to find. So as you can see, all these trends, academic using social media to talk about research, others joining in, as well as contributing to this growing volume of social media data about research, and emergence of tools and techniques to track it, all contributes to the foundation of what we call now altmetric. But what altmetrics is, let's look at some of the definition that can help us to understand where we're at now and what are potential gaps and opportunities. So according to the crowd on Wikipedia, altmetrics is a set of metrics proposed as an alternative to the widely used journal impact factors and personal citation indices like the H index. Priam, one of the early proponents of altmetrics, defined it as study and use of scholarly impact measures based on an activity in online tools and environments. And here's another definition that I like particularly, the creation and study of new metrics based on the social web for analyzing and informing scholarship. So there's lots of similarities between these three definitions, and of course there are more than 3 of them out there, but what is in common essentially is that we are relying on social signals from social web, and we're analyzing it using new metrics. For what purposes? To inform scholarship. And what I also wanted to notice, even though, altmetric by itself, as you know, a bit of controversial name for it, because quite often it's not necessarily what we study and is alternative to traditional impact factors. It's more often it's complementary, showing different side of our impact of our research. But I think it can also be used as an opportunity to constantly remind ourselves when we're conducting altmetrics-related research to try to understand what actually we're measuring. Is it alternative or is it complementary, and to what? But what is definitely clear, the attention, the interest is really on the rise about altmetrics. People are Googling it. This is a chart from Google Trends showing the number of Google hits going up. But do researchers study and publish on altmetrics? So to answer that question, I turned to Web of Sciences, and I conducted a quick search on getting all of the publications that clearly identify themselves about altmetric or altmetrics. And so what I found that the earliest Web of Science has is from 2012, and there are a total of 340 publications. So clearly the field research area altmetrics is growing, but it's still very young, especially if you compare it to more traditional bibliometrics that has thousands of articles in the area. The good news, though, here is for young scholars and starting PhD students, it's a great area to contribute. It's much easier to do literature review, first of all, but also, more importantly, there are lots of research questions that still need to be addressed. When we're trying to understand what's already published in this area, I turned to another visualization tool called Was Viewer, and I took all the abstracts of these 300 or so papers on altmetrics and visualized topics that come in from those abstracts. And so you can see this kind of visual map represents frequently used topics in publications with larger font size, and different color represents different clusters of topics that are related to each other. The blue cluster, just let's quickly go through this map. The blue cluster on your left, essentially with the word Mendeley on top, essentially includes a lot of papers that use Mendeley data. It reminded me in general social media research where there's a disproportional number of papers on Twitter just because Twitter data is accessible, rather than, relatively to number of social media users actually using Twitter. So that's reminding me that perhaps there are opportunities to explore other data sets. So we should not necessarily stay with what's available. There's a red cluster looking at the social networking aspects in general as part of scholarly communication practices. So ResearchGate mentioned there as well. There's a green cluster, altmetrics, mostly talks about measures, the formulas, how do we actually measure, and so on. When you actually read some of the papers, 2 common questions will come up. To what extent articles published in journal are also discussed on social media, so a lot of coverage type of question that's been answered. And the second question that I often see is there's a relationship between altmetrics and more traditional factors, so a lot of correlation type of studies. For example, here's a recent paper that shows block count was the strongest predictor of increased citation. The authors found that one more blog post discussing a publication increases the chance of more citation by about 5%. And the results, interestingly, was very discipline specific. For example, in the area of health sciences, the increase was as high as 36%. So one blog post equal is increased public chance of getting citations by 36% in health sciences. So very interesting results. And if you're interested to kind of continue exploring this map and area, there's a recent review paper on altmetrics by Sugimura and colleagues, just was out this month in JACES, highly recommend. So when we're trying to look at the gaps and opportunities in the field of altmetrics, it's important to consider three main components that make altmetrics possible: data providers, aggregators, and metrics themselves. So let's quickly go through each of these components and see what are those opportunities and gaps are. Let's start with data providers, because this is where we get our data to analyze and study social mentions of scholarly work. So a recent article shows that Twitter is disproportionately used more frequently to talk about academic research. So in about 1 million of articles, they found 68% of them were mentioned on Twitter, followed by Facebook, by blogs, by news websites, and Google+. The results somewhat expected, because it's easier to tweet or retweet link to an article than, of course, write a blog post or appear in a news story. It's also understandable that many scholars don't use Facebook to talk about academic work. So that's why you have only 17% attributed to Facebook data source. I'm quite puzzled why Google Plus is still there, frankly. I don't know if people still use it. But what's also important to realize, what's not on that pie chart. And prominent platforms that are being actively used by academics right now to talk about research, such as ResearchGate and academia.edu, not on that chart. And in part because there's a lack of APIs that would allow us to do proper assessment and data collection. What is also interesting, some platforms that are not on that original pie chart are not there not because of like an API, but because there is somehow lack of interest or attention to those platforms. And this is where I would like to bring your attention to Exhibit A, Reddit. This is the fourth largest social networking website, at least in North America, and a lot of groups on Reddit actually bring in scholars to discuss different disciplines, different areas. In our recent and forthcoming paper, was actually led by one of our postdoctoral researchers, Priya Kumar, who will be chairing a Twitter session tomorrow. So what we found in that paper, analyzing one of the groups, asked historians that about 20% of their messages were providing resources. That includes linking to papers, to books, to websites and blogs. So there's a lot of potential to understand kind of the dissemination of scholarly work on Reddit. So I do encourage more papers in that space. Now that we talk about data providers, let's focus on the second component, the aggregators themselves. And it's great that we have most of you here, and this is not a complete list, of course, but some of the most frequently cited aggregators: PLOS, Altmetric, Impact Factor, Plum Analytics. And what's important here to realize that all of them using slightly different data sources, they measure slightly different things. Of course, the work is very challenging. As somebody who is doing social media analytics, I can certainly appreciate the back end of it, trying to negotiate different APIs, trying to maintain the live streams, trying to track scientific publications. But because of the differences of approaches and sometimes lack of understanding and transparency how certain things are being collected and calculated, there is a really need for transparency, replicability, and accuracy of some of the metrics that are being put out there. And this is just to echo the National Institute of Standards, and specifically the Alternative Assessment Project report that came out last year in 2006. That is actually calling for these three notions. And as a way to help aggregators and researchers and practitioners in this area, the report is putting forward, which I found very useful, kind of the Code of Conduct self-reporting tool. You probably don't see it, but if you follow the slides, there's a link to the report which gives you an example how you can take an altmetric aggregator and run their practices through this self-reporting tool to see, to identify what data sources are used, how they've been used, what's been measured, how frequently metrics are being updated, and so on. So highly encourage you to check it out. Finally, the metrics themselves. So let's talk a little bit about how do we calculate some of the impact factors. Let's start with very basic ones. And of course, we can talk about journal-level metrics, article-level metrics. Just for the purposes of our discussion, let's focus on article-level metrics. And so let's look at once paper is published, many publishers will incorporate some basic counts that we can treat as altmetrics. So how many tweets were tweeted with this article, how many likes on Facebook happened, and so on. So those basic aggregated numbers gives us general interest, but doesn't really tell us who is interested in our paper, why they're interested. So we really need to dig deeper and to see who are the actors who are tweeting or posting or liking our scholarly work. So for example, we can look at some of the Twitter accounts that tweeted our publication, and we can try to classify them on the types, different user types based on the user profile information. Organization versus individual. Altmetrics does it in categories such as members of the public versus practitioners versus science communicators. So that's also, it's already much better than just having one aggregated number. But what I want to focus today on the ability of social networks to inform and enrich some of these metrics. And so as a network scholar, I thought I definitely want to talk about some of the opportunities here as well. So when we say we're analyzing social media data using network analysis, what it really means, once the data is captured, we will represent it as a graph similar to what you see on the screen, where each node will represent a social media user, could be individual, could be organization, and connection will represent more often some kind of interaction. Could be a like, could be retweet, repost, and so on. So, certainly depending on data source, data available to us, we'll be able to build different types of networks. But so I want to demonstrate how network analysis can inform some of the metrics to make them more interesting and more relevant by using results from our earlier paper where we studied who blogs about biomedical literature on diabetes. And so in that paper, what we did essentially, we've collected all of the blogs, as many as we could find through different search engines on diabetes, and we found about 300 of them. And so then we look at how many of those blogs actually cite recent biomedical literature on diabetes. And so here you can see each dot represents, on this network, each dot represents a blog. And red dots, if you can see, represent blogs that actually cited at least one article on biomedical literature. And so what was especially interesting, if I zoom in, oh yes, and by the way, only 10% of blogs, that's not that surprising, cited biomedical literature. And what was interesting, though, to know, most influential blogs, and how we knew they're most influential, it's based on network analysis, they were most connected. They were not published by, they did not cite biomedical literature. So if you Google diabetes and you're searching for blogs on information about diabetes, more likely you'll find patients' blog where they share their experiences. These are important blogs for create a sense of community among patients and create support groups, but they might be lacking in terms of evidence-based discussions. So if we zoom in on that core of these most popular blogs, what you can see, again, the red color blogs are those that cited at least one recent biomedical article, literature on diabetes. What we can see that the red dots kind of distributed throughout this network and appear in different clusters. So here I manually label those clusters to give you a general idea. So the central cluster in the middle, labeled number 1, where you have majority of blogs. These are the most popular blogs on diabetes, again, run mostly by patients, some health communicators. But then you have other clusters, a lot of national, international clusters, Chinese, Japanese blogs, some topical cluster on weight loss, labeled as number 5, clusters around news blogs and newspapers, like Huffington Post on the left side, So what you can see essentially, knowing that somebody mentioned an article gives you only one piece of information. If you actually know where they came from in this network, from what community they came from, it also will tell you who potentially can have access, who potentially can read your publication, whether it is diabetes patients, whether it's somebody in Japan or in China, or whether it's community of weight control bloggers whom you might not necessarily target directly. So the network structure in clustering effect of blogs and other types of social media really gives you that additional dimension and additional research question that you can ask and answer. Finally, this is going to be the last kind of challenge that I want to talk about under this metrics category. And the challenge is actually the elephant in the room that we all need to address. The bots, social bots, they arise, and they're really threatening the integrity of the field, the integrity and acceptance and reliance on altmetrics by people, especially people outside of this community. So we really need to address the issue essentially. If we're counting blogs, tweets, Facebook posts that mention our research, are we sure that these are humans, or are these mostly bots? And not to say that all bots are bad. There are lots of publishers who use bots to help spread the word around new publications. But at least we need to discuss how do we identify them, separate them, and incorporate in altmetrics. So luckily, most of the bots' activities were around commercial interests, selling free music, adult entertainment, diets, various gambling contests, and so on. Lately, we talked a lot about political bots, of course, in the context of the 2016 US election and how they threatened the democracy. So I think we should expect that as it becomes very easy to create a bot on social media, we'll see more bots tweeting and engaging with academic research. And we really need to separate those different impact factors from different bots. The good news, though, we have technology to detect them. And this slide essentially just briefly outlines some of the features that can be helpful in terms of automatically detecting bots' activities, bot accounts. Previous research looked at the identifying profile images and clustering them based on the color, age, histogram properties, and densities to identify similar accounts that might have been created at the same time. Some research look at the actual content, so having dictionaries of certain words that triggers detection may be helpful. Bots tend to have URLs, they tend to tweet multiple times, there's a lot of hashtags, but some of this also may relate to what we use in our practices to disseminate research. So then we have to look at additional properties, we have to examine information about who posts messages, look at even usernames, how often, how frequently we engaged. It's impossible probably for a human being to tweet 24/7, so you can easily see some, or try to see some of the patterns in tweeting or posting behavior. Creation date has proven to be useful as well. Bots often create it as a batch, so by automatic scripts. So if you know when an account was created, you can try to figure out if they are created as a cluster. And again, network analysis has proven to be very useful by just looking at the social network signals, the centralities, the clustering effects can also indicate some of the bots' activities. So you can see there are lots of techniques that help us to detect bots. The challenge here, I think, is how do we introduce these emerging techniques to altmetrics researchers and practitioners and developers who using social media as their go-to source and will most benefit from this work. So this is kind of one of the calls for today. But I also want to kind of finish this presentation to summarize all the challenges that was mentioned here and outline opportunities. We saw there's a lack of access to some data providers, ResearchGate, academia.edu, other platforms, or there's a lack of interest to some of the platforms. So I definitely see an opportunity for us as a field to explore those gaps. Something we didn't talk, at least not yet today about, but how do we actually track mentions? And a lot of it, what we do right now, would rely on some kind of unique identifier to track mentions, which gives us perhaps good quality of detection, but we might miss a lot of other mentions. So that's an ongoing area of research. Reliance on different data providers across different data aggregators is an issue, as well as the fact that different aggregators measure different things. And that, as you saw, kind of leads to the call and need for more transparency, replicability, and accuracy of when we measure something in altmetrics. And finally, I wanted to bring your attention to the fact that social media data is very noisy, perhaps not a surprise for you, especially if you're actively working in this space. But to the fact that there are social bots, and we as a field will be affected by them, more so in the near future, and we need to be prepared. Otherwise, the people, especially outside of this community, may question the validity and reliance of some of these metrics. So I'll finish at that, and I want to finish on a positive note that people who can answer those questions and already answering those questions and challenges are in this room. And I'm really looking forward to your presentations today, tomorrow, and seeing how you handle some of these challenges. If we have time for questions, we'd love to hear your questions and comments. Thank you.
Yeah, I feel like the idea of trying to identify bots in a way that they're not going to counteract is fundamentally in tension with the idea of transparency. You could say, so transparency is an important thing, being able to understand how a metric was created. How do you identify Twitter bots in a way that's transparent, which doesn't give away your game to the bots? Is that possible? Mm-hmm. And should we be re-examining the idea full stop that requires us to identify bots automatically?
Thank you. You're absolutely right. It is an arms race. In fact, last year when I was presenting on social bots more generally, a developer in the room said, well, thank you for sharing the insights that bots tend to be created on Fridays, disproportionately higher than on Mondays. I will make sure to implement that in my algorithm next time I create one. So you're absolutely right. It is arms race. In terms of how can we be more transparent, I think it all comes down to the methodology we use to detect them. So if we publish, talk about this is the methodology we use at this stage for this data set, it gives opportunity for others to say, well, maybe you still have in data set about 5% of your accounts are bots, but at least you're upfront about it. This is what you're capturing at the time you captured it. So thank you.
Do we have another question? I do have an observation already, actually. And it might be a little bit early to start drawing conclusions from the conference, given that haven't even hit the first coffee break yet. There is definitely an uptick in the amount of interest that's being paid in the area of network analysis. We heard a little bit of it yesterday, and even 2 years ago, in Amsterdam, we had presentations from the University of Ireland in Galway, who were building heterogeneous networks of social media. But we clearly also need to draw some of this work together, because just off the top of my head, I can think of 3 or 4 research teams who were working in this space, but without any sense of direction. I'm really interested in how you think we can use social media to pull this work together and to inform different research teams of the kind of work that's going on, before publication happens. Mm-hmm.
So is the question more about how to create this type of collaboration, how to bring network scholars to this community?
Yeah, in particular, because it tallies with that view that you were bringing in of the historical analysis. You know, previously where you had a handful of scholars around the world, they were writing letters to each other, they were exchanging ideas. So you can do a kind of an early historical network analysis of those letters to understand who was having ideas and who was communicating with each other. We're a lot more connected nowadays, but we're also a lot more broken up. And it's a question of, well, how do we bring together that intimacy of intellectual development to frame some of the research questions in the future?
Yeah, well, thank you for this question, opportunity to discuss how we can bring more network scholars to this area. Well, we want to encourage them to collaborate with us. One way to do it is through creation and publicizing network data sets. Network scholars love to have some graphs and networks to analyze. So if you have a ready available data set, look around your institutions, look around among your colleagues who is doing network analysis, say, hey, I have this lovely data set of who is talking to whom, or who is connecting, who follows whom on certain platform. Would you like to join me as part of the team? Oh, I heard you're developing this cool community detection algorithm. Let's evaluate it in the context of altmetric and see how well it performs in this community. So I think it is a bit of work and a bit of going outside of our comfort zone, but I think this field, altmetrics, it naturally fits in terms of analyzing this data as a networks. So perhaps some of us should also go to other conferences where networks is the thing for most of the presentation. So Sunbelt International Social Network Analysis Conference comes to mind, but there are many, many others. And I'm happy to share some of the thoughts, what other conferences or publications to check out during the break. Thank you, Mike, for that.
That's a really clear, actionable insight, and I'm going to look forward to chasing some people up and having a conversation with them. Do we have any more? We have one more question from the audience. I see a mustard-coloured sleeve rise up at the end there. Do you want to move forward, and that'd be a French mustard. Do you want to move forward and speak into the microphone, please? Okay, we have a microphone.
I've got one here, I think.
Excellent.
I have a question. I work quite a bit in bibliometrics, where there I do a lot of network analysis. And one of the things that frustrates me when I come to altmetrics is the lack of the ability to do network analysis, for example, within the tools. Do you think that, in terms of the community, if we wanted to do more network analysis in altmetrics, is what's holding us back the knowledge of network studies, which is obviously quite a complex area, or is it the lack of the connections within the tools that we might use for our work, for example, the aggregators? Because they very often will have, oh, this mention or that mention, but not which mentions, for example, are connected.
It's a good point. I don't think it's a lack of tool that's stopping us from doing this type of work. It's, again, going back to Mike's point, is our ability to build connections across disciplines. A lot of altmetrics is about both worlds. It's about information science, about bibliometrics, more traditional impact factors, but it's also about communication practices. So I think the communication side, the communication researchers who are relying on social network analysis to analyze networks, those that come from social media, maybe need to be more informed about opportunities in this area as well. Maybe they don't even think about that that's the area they can contribute to. Yeah. So it's definitely not the lack of tools, I think.
So do you think it's more likely the lack of expertise? Because if you don't know about networks, it's quite challenging to analyze them, especially if there's no tool readily available for you to do so.
Expertise is something we can develop. We can also bring collaborators who will have that expertise. So my point here is that the expertise is out there, and expertise among people who actually already analyzing social media data. It's about reaching out to them and inviting them to the mix. And I think conversations, what we're having today is the opportunity for me to encourage you to reach out to those individuals. And also a bit, we didn't have a lot of time, but to at least highlight some of the opportunities that you can reach by applying network analysis to your own data sets. Yeah, so
thank you.
Hi, my name is Hans. I have a question on Anatoly. Do you think the role of funders or funding agencies should be more proactive in basically demanding the use of social communications, really extra to just producing an article?
Can you repeat the role of what agencies?
Funding agencies.
Funding agencies. Well, they are indirectly doing that, at least in Canada. So I cannot speak for other countries, but in fact, a couple of years ago, our funding agency, those of us who are located here, live here, know, they incorporated a third evaluation component. So to evaluating the excellence of research proposal and research team expertise, now they're evaluating knowledge mobilization component. So this is where we have to explain how we will talk about our research, and social media is a huge component of it. Informal communication, the funding agencies do require us to also find potential partners, and one way to do it is, of course, to communicate research through social media. So can they do a better job? Maybe, but those of us in academia who are not used to being very public about our work, we're already feeling pressure. So I think we are at that level, at least in Canada, that is comfortable and yet educational in terms of helping us to explore, well, can we use Twitter, can we use blogs in terms of disseminating work? And maybe somebody can share your experience with other funding agencies. We'd love to hear if we have a moment. So Europe, Asia, US, anyone? Do you feel your agencies are doing enough work, encouraging scholars to promote work online?
Point about the relationship of funders. I'm not wishing to market my own events, but I'm organizing a conference in Baltimore in 2 weeks' time, which is about reflecting on how funders want metrics to be used, do use metrics. So we've got folk from the NIH and NSF and so forth coming along to talk about it, because that's also been a missing part of the conversation, that we haven't quite yet joined up all the components of people who do use metrics and who can use metrics. So, you know, we do have I think a job of work to build more connections between different interested parties. But also, ethically, we have to recognize that we have different interests in these things as well, and there is a whole philosophical dimension as well about what are we measuring and how we translate in what we think we're measuring into actionable insights and ultimately influencing funding decisions. So this little conference has a role to play in building some of those connections, right. I think. Do we have any more connections? I'm aware that we're running a little bit early, and I don't know if the coffee is going to be ready yet. Kat? Was that an indication about the coffee, or no?
So you spoke about ResearchGate and Academia EDU. Obviously, a lot of activity goes on there, but we just can't track it because they don't provide their data. Do you think there are things that we could do, or we could work with? What do you think would it take to convince them to open up their platforms and interact more with the wider community?
Thank you for this question. And can I ask if anybody from ResearchGate or Academia.edu in the room? So that would be one step, to invite them to speak at this conference next year.
Okay, we're going to put that one in, actually, on the schedule for next year.
Wonderful.
We're going to invite...
and the second...
What should we call them? We can't call them closed platforms, but we'll call them... Yeah, we'll have a discussion about those platforms next year.
Yeah. So find a way to incorporate, to bring them into the community so they actually see the value of APIs. You show them what APIs did for other platforms in this area, what it can do for them. So certainly it should be a win-win proposition. The other step would be, of course, to rely on self-reported data from, and that's what's been published right now around ResearchGate, Academia.edu. It's actually engaging maybe some kind of crowdsourcing experiment where scholars self-reporting some of their activities, interactions. But unless we have APIs, we can really connect our altmetric tools, unfortunately. So that would be the first step.
But one possible view would be to ask them to collaborate with researchers to release a data set, a network data set. I mean, that would be a possibility. It's possible.
I would be reluctant to, due to the lack of any data, probably that would be the best, but I would be reluctant to advocate for this route because we saw what happened with, let's say, Facebook data sets. When in early years of Facebook would handpick certain scholars to collaborate with, and only then they would have access to a particular restricted data set. So again, we're hitting the challenge of replicability, transparency of the research.
Yeah, sure.
And so once that's established, it's really hard for new, younger scholars to get into the field, to get access. Then you have this dynamics of data-rich and data-poor researchers with different privileges. So I would be cautious in terms of advocating for this. But as a pilot, as a first step to show them a potential value and impact of their data sets, but maybe. Yes, maybe.
Interesting.
So this is a really nice segue to point out that your slides are marked as private, Anatoly.
Can you repeat this question? There's a bit of echo here, sorry.
The segue is to the fact that your slides are marked as private.
Wow. Talking about access and data access, wow. I'll fix that after the session, thank you.
Hi, I've got a forest of hands springing up. This is really great. Can we get the gentleman at the back first, and then I'll take... Okay, thank you.
Richard Halser from the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles. You'll hear from me tomorrow. So, you know, it was interesting to me from a competitive analysis standpoint that it seems like the group is already ceded to ResearchGate and academia. And the challenge, I think, is if they're not going to cooperate, do something better than they do. And I haven't seen, the challenge I have is on my researchers, you know, ResearchGate talks to them every day, and I use that in quotes, right? And we all know that. So they're doing something right because they're voluntarily putting information into ResearchGate every day. So what is it that characteristically that they're doing that, and you know, they're a private organization, so they have the capability to focus on that, and maybe others don't. But I wonder, instead of ceding to them, that there's some actions, and there might be some very smart people in this room who could, I think there is, to see, well, if you can't get them to join, then beat them, if you will. And that's a tough challenge. And you know, whoever is the big one today may or may not be the big one tomorrow, as we've seen in everything. So, you know, with my organization, I look at how difficult it is to put information into some of the other tools for myself. So looking at ORCID and others, and because of that, my stuff isn't even in there the way it should be, and therefore it can't be tracked. So I just wonder if we need to expand our minds and look at some possibilities there and see how maybe some of those kinds of things could be done to circumvent that, if you will. I don't know. A lot of academics don't look at things competitively, having come from corporate, you know, and I think altmetrics can be highly competitive to private organizations, and maybe they are, but you wouldn't know it. So just a food for thought.
So a proposition essentially is saying create an alternative social networking for academics where we would have access to APIs. Yeah. And that's a big challenge. Again, we saw Google tried a couple times at least to beat Facebook, and same challenges are there. First movers advantage. You have a strong core of users who already adopted and embrace a platform. So what are the incentives for them to take their data and move elsewhere, especially as we know it's very time-consuming to build up some of these networks. And in many cases, you may be able to move the data, but you might not be able to move the connections, the conversations. So I think it's an easier route to try to get the data through the existing platforms. It's much harder to create something that will stick for academics. Not to say that there won't be something new that emerged. And when we talk about knowledge mobilization and disseminating our scholarly work, we already have a mechanism, at least on the information dissemination side. It's called institutional repositories. So let's work with our librarians, friendly librarians, to encourage more scholars to deposit some of our work to those repositories. And maybe those repositories should be more social. Maybe just similarly what we did with Biodiversity Heritage Library, we need to reconsider how to make those objects and records and institutional repositories more social. Maybe there are some tips for that here. So, but thank you for your question.
I would just like to respond to that.
Yes.
As a librarian, I actively have conversations with our researchers in regards to depositing into our institutional repository. Our institutional repository actually does have PlumX metrics generated as part of their deposit. It has created incentive. However, there is still an ongoing, somewhat hostile conversation, or at least response that we get from researchers still around open and the consequences around open. So I know that's sort of tangential to AM, but it still is integrated with that, and that's an ongoing effort for the librarian community with our researchers, and probably an active conversation that the AM community probably needs to consider and think about.
Thank you. So just a quick follow-up. So the hostility comes, you saying, from researchers themselves. They don't want their work to be open?
That's correct. They still have a big issue with sharing.
Okay, and that just shows that there's more work to be done on the educational side, but as well as the tools building, the networking features, I think there should be multiple benefits for them to deposit their work. And so you're right, some of it is education, some of them to help them show the benefit of, If we have, maybe we have a couple more minutes before coffee arrives. Any more questions or comments?
Yes, we've got one more question here.
I love the conversation,
patient,
yes.
Very patient
you.
colleague there. Unless I see a waving hand, I'm going to make this the last one.
I'll make it a good one then.
Okay, bring it home.
Rebecca Kennison, CAN Consultants. One of the really interesting things that we dance around a lot is that the same problem with altmetrics is the same problem with bibliometrics and other citation practices, which is a lack of context. There's a particular example that I have in mind, a humanities philosophy article that is, not to put too fine a point on it, perhaps a little clickbaity, that a certain publisher has made open, in fact. So everyone can access this. It has an altmetric score of 402, which is pretty awesome in altmetrics land. Almost all of that discussion was negative, shall we say. Do you have any thoughts about how we can start to contextualize and really help people to understand that this score, I mean, and again, this is a long-time problem that we all know about. Same thing with impact factors and so on, that can't determine whether somebody's saying this is a terrible article or this is a great article. So if you have any thoughts on that, I'd really love to hear that, because it's something that's near and dear to my heart.
You're absolutely right, and it's the same issue exists in bibliometrics as well. I love discussions around how do we create negative altmetric score, in a way what you mentioned, what if people criticizing somebody's work. Some may say that, well, it doesn't matter whether they're for or against a particular publication, it shows the attention, the reach. So if that's the case, if we, in this camp that it doesn't matter, we just measure in the reach and extent of attention for the work, then we just need to be, again, transparent in terms of how do we interpret in those counts. So it may be good that people are interested in this link to this free article. We may not know whether they're interested in the topic, more likely that's why they shared, or the fact that it's free, but we already know that open access may help spread the word and may help increase readership. So A, I guess to answer your question, we can say we don't care, but then we have to be upfront about it. B, we can try to rely on more kind of natural language processing techniques, which is much computationally harder to parse those messages, the content that's mentioned. We do have that opportunity, the data is there, and you identify a good research direction for future work. So thank you.
There's some very interesting work being done in Drexel about extracting knowledge from messages and in particular weighting the strength of the message as well. There's some really interesting research questions around there. I've got one final question here at the front here, and then we're going to round up.
Hi, I'll try and make this quick. I'm John Armstrong with Discovery Engine, and I just wanted to follow on from that question of context, which, you know, essentially all of the data sources that altmetrics rely on are indirect or proxy signals. Mm-hmm. Is altmetrics inherently a science of indirect signals, or is there a way to get a direct signal?
Can you repeat the science of?
Of indirect signals, of developing metrics from indirect signals.
Well, that's for the field to address, I think. And, you know, if you measure in indirect and direct together, if the goal to get the reach, to assess the reach of the work, maybe that doesn't matter whether you measure in direct or indirect. But as this field evolves, I think those questions will be becoming more prominent. Because we already address low-hanging fruits right now, you know, basic counts, basic reach. I think that's why we need to get deeper and say, what is the context? What is the influence? Is it direct or indirect? Is that what you hinting?
Well, I mean, essentially that. I mean, as long as you are working with an indirect signal, you potentially have problems like context and so forth. So can you imagine a way to get a direct signal?
Well, social media is messy. I don't think we ever get to that point. I think it's the question is, how do we work in this environment that is very noisy and there are lots of uncertainties. And again, going back to the first question, so it's nice you brought that up, because the first question was about how to detect bots, and when the bots always you know, getting better and better, it's about being transparent about our methodologies. And then there's that important social science component, and I was pleased to see papers at this conference handling that issue as well. So in what context altmetrics has been used on the one hand, and on the other hand, trying to understand what actually those measures suggest, intention versus impact and so on. So I don't think we have time to address your question, but as a field, I think it's time to handle those discussions. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, I think you have to start by assuming a bidirectionality and assuming there's some agency behind the connections, and then try and prove them out rather than work on a unidirectional manner and then sort of add layers to it. I think we're going to have to get to a stage where we're thinking using very complex tools and methodologies to understand the network of connections before then work towards making it simpler rather than the other way around. I think that's probably a false friend to start simple. But anyway, I'd like to thank you very much. We have had an amazingly good discussion to start our conference, and I would like to give Anatoly a final round of applause before we head off for coffee. Thank you.
And I promise to make slides available. So the link will be the same.
CC0 or?
All right. Thanks.
That was really fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike.
That was easily the best keynote we've had ever on Metric.
Thank you.